All right, so all three of us are from the environmental consulting firm AKRF. As part of, yeah. I think this is working, right? Yeah, okay. Just like so we are from AKRF, from the Cultural Resources Department there. So we include architectural historians and archaeologists. And we're here today to talk about some of the resiliency projects that we've worked on over the last few years. So initially, kind of mirroring the nature of these projects in general, most of our resiliency-related projects were sort of emergency relief-oriented efforts, kind of reactionary in nature. For example, we had an on-call contract with the Governor's Office of Storm Recovery, reviewing applications for relief funding and doing, very quick National Register eligibility assessments as part of that. And then the nature of the projects has sort of shifted over time to more proactive planning and documentation projects. So that is the nature of the projects that we're going to talk about today. From a architectural resources point of view, we're going to talk about two projects that we're currently working on for the New York State Office of Historic Preservation. A post-Sandy resiliency initiative to document historic resources in flood-prone areas through a federally funded post-Sandy initiative. And then also an example of an archaeological resiliency project. So first we'll discuss the two waterfront survey projects that I mentioned. The first of the two projects is based in New York City. So select flood-prone neighborhoods in Staten Island, Queens, and the Bronx. And then our second project, which we'll just sort of allude to that we're still working on, covers other areas of Manhattan and the Bronx, as well as municipalities in Westchester, Rockland, and Orange counties upstate. And then Michael will talk about the Living Breakwaters project, an archaeological project in Staten Island. All right, so Cameron's gonna start off talking about the overall project and methodology for the Waterfront Survey project, and then I'll get into focusing on some of the historic districts that we've looked at as part of that project.
Hi everyone, I'm Cameron Robertson. So basically, as Molly said, this project has been split up in kind of to two phases. The first phase, as Molly mentioned, is taking place in the Bronx, Queens, and Staten Island. So we're covering over 63 neighborhoods, which is amazing. Covering a lot of ground. We've been doing this for about 3 years. And this is looking mainly at flood risk areas. And then in phase two, we're looking at New York and Bronx County. We're looking at Westchester County, Orange, and Rockland County as well. So in New York and Bronx County, you see an example of the South Street Seaport Historic District. That's one of our 12 neighborhoods that we're looking at. And we've already kind of started working on that historic context right there. And then Westchester County, we're going to be looking at 7 municipalities. In Orange County, we'll be looking at 3 municipalities. And then in Rockland County, we'll be also looking at 3 municipalities. So how we're doing this project is we're basically using this Trimble software program. Can you guys hear me? I'm sorry. Okay. We're using this Trimble software program, which uses GIS coordinates for us to basically map it on this map. So this is where we're storing all of our data. So when we're going out into the field to these different neighborhoods and these different municipalities, we're taking iPads with us that has this software on there, and we are plotting points with properties that we may be considered National Register eligible. And once it's on this map, there is a survey form that is correlated with it that I'm going to talk about a little bit more in detail in the next couple of slides. But this is great because this has stored our data for the last 3 years. You can see already on this map, this is some of the properties alone that we've just surveyed in the Bronx, which is a lot. You see lots of orange dots. But we're looking at, like I said, all these neighborhoods in flood-prone areas, and you're able to research it through addresses, you're able to look through it on the map, or you're able to filter it kind of through that silo up there that you see. So basically, I'm going to take you through our documentation process that we kind of have created and had to put together over the last couple of years. So first of all, we basically start with our neighborhood map, and we give this to the SHPO's office, and they kind of confirm, that these are the neighborhood boundaries that they want us to look at. So from there, once we get confirmation from SHPO, we're basically State Historic Preservation Office. Sorry. So once we get confirmation from the State Historic Preservation Office, we can start working on our neighborhood context. So basically, this neighborhood context, requires primary and secondary sources, but we also try as best as we can to reach out to local historical societies, local historians who, probably have a lot more expertise in, and a lot more knowledge about these specific areas than perhaps we do. So basically, this neighborhood context is made up of our methodology, it includes our historic context, and later on, it includes our associated property types and registration requirements, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So once we have all this, our context is mostly complete, we start to go on our site visits. And site visits can take, depending on the size of the neighborhood, depending on how many known resources that we come across, how many potential resources that we come across that may be National Register eligible, it could take 2 hours, or it can take multiple days of us having to go out there. So like I said, we've been doing this for almost 3 years, so it does take a while. But once we go out onto our site visits, we basically, while we're in the field, we're creating this Recon form. So on the slide here, you see the Trimble Recon form. This is the kind of form that we're filling out as we go on that Trimble software program. So we're filling out the addresses, we're taking pictures of the property, we're labeling what its current use may be. We're also looking at, if it has a property name that we know of, and whether or not we think it might be eligible or uncertain currently, according to National Register criterion. So once we've kind of gone through these Recon forms, we've gone through some of our site visits, we always meet as a team, and we go through the properties, and we kind of decide which ones we really believe are eligible based off the National Register criteria. And we start populating more of the Recon form, as you saw on the last slide, just making sure that we have the correct date based off sandboard maps or other research, making sure that we didn't miss maybe what its current use is, maybe making sure that we didn't miss a property name. So we continue that research once we've kind of decided we want to send this along to SHPO. So as you can see here, we've, at this point in the stage, we've updated our context and our figures, which includes the map, and we've updated our Recon forms, and all of this will go to the State Historic Preservation Office for them to review. From there, the State Historic Preservation Office then will give us feedback saying, we believe that these properties may be eligible. So then at that time, they ask us to fill out a intensive form, which is a next level of the Trimble software program, which you can see on the slide here. So in-house, we have our intensive form, which requires us to look at period of significance, physical description of the building itself, statement of significance, if we know of any alterations through our research. It's pretty, like it's called, it's pretty intensive. So we fill that out in-house, so you'll see an example of kind of like what we're doing. And then we'll take all that information that we have and we'll carry it over into the Trimble survey. So on the Trimble survey, you'll see it asks for roof materials, foundation materials. So basically, once all that's filled out and our context, has been updated based off SHPO's feedback, we'll do a final submission. And after this final submission, our part of the documentation process is complete. We're done with Trimble, we're done with all of that. At that point, the State Historic Preservation Office decides what is truly eligible, and then they will update that in the CRIS system. So I'm just going to share some of our survey results. As you can see, over the last couple of years, we've surveyed a lot. We've done over, I believe, how many? We've done 63 neighborhoods, as I said. We've identified over 12,000 properties, or 1,200 properties. We've completed over 400 intensive forms and identified 14 historic districts in these 3 boroughs. And you'll see asterisks next to these numbers. This is because SHPO is still reviewing some of our properties at the intensive level form. But honestly, this is an amazing amount of data that we've been able to collect so far for not only the State Historic Preservation Office, but also the public as well. But Molly's now going to come up and talk about some of the historic districts that we've been able to identify.
Okay, so as Cameron said, we're looking at historic districts and individual properties that are eligible for the National Register. So it's not a New York City landmark evaluation, it's purely National Register. And we're resurveying existing landmarks, existing historic districts and individually eligible or listed properties that haven't been documented in the last 15 years. But what I'm just going to focus on now is the newly identified historic districts that have been part of our survey. And again, I think Cameron said this, but with this first stage of the project, this is looking at only areas that are within FEMA's flood risk areas, shown in the maps. So the first historic district that we identified is a commercial historic district on City Island, which includes 52 properties and has a period of significance from 1860 to 1940. I'm going to have to go through these pretty quickly since there's a lot of them, but I hope we can talk more about them afterwards. There's also a small Tudor Cottages Historic District on City Island as well. It's determined National Register eligible. We also delineated the Pelham Bay Park Historic District. So sort of a fun one for me because my first job out of grad school was doing a cultural landscape inventory for Historic House Trust for Pelham Bay Park. So it's kind of coming full circle. It's now officially a National Register eligible historic district. Including the Bartow Pell Mansion, American Boy statue, Split Rock, golf course, and lots of other diverse sorts of resources. In Port Morris in the Bronx, we identified an industrial historic district sort of along Willow Avenue and surrounding streets. We expanded the National Register listed Fort Schuyler to a SUNY Maritime Historic District in Throgs Neck in the Bronx to include other buildings, including power plant and housing associated with the sort of military installation and Merchant Marine campus there. One of the most exciting historic districts that we've identified is a National Register eligible Flushing Meadows Corona Park Historic District. Prior to this is essentially a collection of individually listed or eligible properties. So it was exciting to kind of bring it all together as a historic district. Interestingly, 2 workers' houses collections have been identified as historic districts as part of this project. First one being workers' housing associated with the Steinway Piano Company in Ditmar, Steinway, Queens. Basically 30 almost identical brick row houses. And in Laurelton, Queens, we had a bit of a challenge because it's a large area with a very sort of uniform history and building type, but the level of historic integrity varies quite a bit. So we sat down with SHPO multiple times to kind of figure out how to approach Laurelton, and the end result was 3 historic districts, all sort of relating to the 1920s to 1940s suburban development of this area, mostly Tudor Revival row houses. So here's an example of a Laurelton Historic District along 228th Street, a larger historic district along 229th and 230th Street in Laurelton, and lastly, a historic district in Laurelton along Mentone Avenue, 141st Avenue, and surrounding streets. And a lot of these streets still retain kind of the center median and aspects of its original nature as planned community. The second workers' housing historic district that we identified is the Kreischer workers' houses in Staten Island. This is one of the few cases where these buildings were New York City landmarked, but hadn't yet been determined eligible for the National Register. And as you can see, it's more than a collection of workers' housing. The buildings are unified by their Kreischer brick sidewalk. These are all workers' housing associated with the Kreischer brickworks. So even though it's a little bit of a fragment of what it once was, these remaining 4 houses retain a lot of integrity. The last historic district that we've identified that we're actually still kind of working on, so I haven't put all the data here, is historic Richmond town. And that's a really particularly interesting one because although an effort was made to get Richmond town listed as a historic district ever since it was first sort of being put together, that attempt has always failed because of the National Register's consideration that basically disqualifies moved buildings from meeting the National Register criteria. And while some of the buildings in Richmond town are in their original locations, many were moved there. So the exciting thing about what we're looking at now is that just as of this year, a lot of the moved buildings are kind of meeting the 50-year threshold, that they've been in their current locations for 50 years. So it gives an opportunity to look at historic Richmond town as being significant as a recreation village and extending its period of significance and having all of these moved buildings considered contributing features within the district. So it's been fun to reach out to some of the folks who were kind of involved in the early stages of putting Richmond town together, like Bill McMillan, whose father founded this, and he grew up there. Some of the buildings at Richmond town. So now we're continuing with sort of the second phase of our project, and here's an example of South Street Seaport. That's one area that we've been asked to take a fresh look at, so it's interesting that there's a lot of discussion about South Street Seaport at the HDC. But SHPO is interested in expanding the period of significance, taking a closer look at the contributing and non-contributing resources that were identified originally. It's really in need of updating from that respect, so we're working on that now. And as we mentioned before, we're also doing survey work in Orange County, Rockland County, and Westchester County. And then we also sort of feel like as we're bringing these projects, these massive projects to a close, it's hard to sort of see the forest for the trees with the documentation work. So we're trying to kind of step back and see where are the opportunities for kind of analyzing this data and making some sense and meaningful conclusions out of these patterns from kind of a storm resiliency perspective. So we're trying to now kind of step back and look at patterns of property types in flood-prone areas, patterns of loss of integrity, whether that be due to storm damage or other economic, cultural factors, and trying to think of how this survey work can help inform future storm recovery relief efforts. One of the patterns that's jumped out to us quite a bit is the fact that a lot of the neighborhoods that are most at risk, sort of the historic maritime-centered communities that are right on the waterfront, whose economic engines were related to fishing, oystering, that sort of thing. A lot of these communities are not only at highest risk, but they also have lost a lot of integrity, in part because they've been affected by storms in the past. Places like Jamaica Bay and the Rockaways and the South Shore of Staten Island. So as we've been looking at it, we've been thinking a lot of these places have only a few properties that actually meet the National Register eligibility criteria because they've been so altered over the course of time, but they still have a sense of place. They're still important aspects of the city's history, and they're particularly vulnerable. So it's important to have a discussion about how we can document and protect these areas that may not actually meet the National Register eligibility criteria. So here are some great historic photos of Broad Channel. A lot of other communities in Jamaica Bay have such a rich history. Even as a turn-of-the-century sort of vacationing fishing community, it was a very vibrant and important part of New York City history. Now, there's very little of that left in the Rockaways and Jamaica Bay that's kind of in a form that meets the National Register eligibility criteria. These are two examples that did in Hamels, but as you can see with the top right photo, it's sort of like just by the skin of their teeth. I mean, they've been so highly altered and they've been so hard hit by previous flood events that for these two examples, there's a host of examples that just don't meet the National Register eligibility criteria, but they're still collectively form a sense of place. One more example is Howard Beach, and one such fishing community whose heyday was sort of the turn of the century. It's formerly called Ramblersville. It just sort of barely exists. Traces of the boardwalk and the actual buildings are still there, but they've mostly been altered with vinyl siding, replacement windows, so a lot of them have been physically raised up. So it's difficult to call these communities historic districts or even pick out individual examples that are National Register eligible, but it's clear that they have a sense of place, that they're a vanishing community type in New York City, and that we need to expand our planning and documentation to figure out how to appreciate and document these sorts of communities. So on that note, I'll hand it over to Michael for a discussion of our archaeological work.
I apologize to those of you who came here to a preservation conference and you're getting to listen to a little bit of archaeology. So this is your chance to quickly escape if you want. I'll go quickly. There was a big storm in 2012. The part of New York City that was most dramatically affected by Hurricane Sandy was at Staten Island, which is located the southernmost borough, and the southern shore facing the ocean. The coastline was probably the most severely affected of all of the boroughs. So you can see here examples of erosion along the coastline. There was also a great deal of destruction to structures, personal property. In response to this hurricane event, the Department of Housing and Urban Development had a competition. They tried to look for projects that could offer resiliency, to fortify the coastline, better integrate and incorporate structural improvements with the existing communities. This is a quick snapshot of the whole project. It was two components. One of them was off in the water. This is out in the bay, south of Staten Island, a series of large concrete structures. And there was also a coastal feature, that yellow line. It's sort of a berm, going to have trails, give communities a chance to better interact and access the water while protecting this very highly populated area. These are some cross sections. There's lots of information on the project online if you're more interested in how it all works. And this is a schematic of the coastal berm. And these two aerial images show how the project will better create a stable coastline. It's experienced a great deal of erosion over the time. This is primarily because of the location of Staten Island at the crux of the New York Bight, this giant landform defined by the east-west oriented Long Island and the north-south shore of New Jersey, and the Hudson Canyon down cutting through the bottom of it. This funnels in storm events directly towards our communities. This is what it looks like from a 3D point of view of New York Bight. We can see that the darker waters are further from shore and the waters are quite shallow closer to Staten Island. This is the same view about 5,000 years ago, as a great deal of the water in the area was trapped in the ice sheets further to the north. Now, this is 5,000 years ago. Our project area is up here. The Army Corps of Engineers did a big study of this area, trying to figure out what's the archaeological sensitivity of this area tied with a dredging type project. They looked at things like how does the coastline evolve over time with vegetation, the accumulation of soils. They looked at borings within the harbor, and they ultimately came up with this sensitivity map. And you can see in the box, the Living Breakwaters project down at the southern tip of Staten Island was identified as having sensitivity for now submerged and deeply buried archaeological resources. As they started to do this project, AKRF did the environmental planning and Section 106 compliance to look at the impacts of the project on our cultural resources. This was a few phases of work: documentary research, the stuff that Cameron and Molly just discussed, a geoarchaeological survey off the coast, and some work on the land portions of the project. This is an example of the documentary research. Elizabeth Mead, who's here, did this research, comparing the coastline today in purple with what it was only 100 years ago in 1911. You can see the huge amount of erosion that has been dynamically occurring. And this is a sensitivity map showing where areas of sensitivity for prehistoric resources or historic resources are situated along this coastline that's going to be impacted by this resiliency project. Now, out offshore, where they're building these large concrete structures to break the force of storm-related waves, they were going to do a series of geotechnical borings, and we took advantage of that program to look at the presence or absence of deeper archaeological resources. They looked at split spoons of these cores. They collected samples of the cores, submitted them to flotation to look for botanical remains within them, and you can see steps in that process in these photographs here. During that process, we found some botanical remains deeply buried that were from terrestrial plants. These are non-marine. Also a few chips of stone. There were the kinds of stone artifacts used by prehistoric peoples on Staten Island. Submitted the samples to radiocarbon dating off on the right. And interestingly enough, or at least to me, down below about 25 feet of the gray, silty marine clays, there was a thin band of brown soil with wooden remains. We subjected those wood remains to carbon-14 dating, and they dated to about 5,000 years ago. So this was a time when, if you remember that 3D view, waters were lower. This was the habitable portion of Staten Island, subsequently buried by marine soils. This is the project site today. It's part of the conference house park. These are some pictures showing the various uses, land uses and erosion and some of the previous activities that took place there. We dug a bunch of holes in the ground as well. You can see them digging holes on the right, and found a few additional chips of stone, similar to the ones we found offshore in the borings. made out of chert and jasper, the types of materials that were used in prehistory to make tools. And now to quickly summarize, so we did find this, this submerged habitable landform. Although the area has archaeological sensitivity, they don't meet the criteria for being considered National Register eligible. And then I will close with the irony that it was only through this resiliency project designed to protect the contemporary populations of Staten Island that we're able to find evidence of habitations that were a result of earlier pre-inundation activities. Thank you very much.
If anybody has any questions. Yeah.
Just a note before I ask my question. That Trimble software that you're doing, I heard the same kind of a presentation last week regarding invasive species of plants that are being done through an organization called Invasive or something similar to that, using the same kind of documentation for mapping. It basically is being done through citizen science volunteer kinds of work. I don't know if you're familiar with that or not.
No.
Same exact kind of documentation. My question is, two maritime areas that will be changed considerably in the next 30 years, both because of New York City zoning and also because of just the natural processes of gentrification. Did you look at the Gowanus and Newtown Creek at all, and did any of those properties meet your criteria for SHPCO?
Well, I would say that we should have pointed out too that as part of the state has. So as part of these projects that have been federally funded and administered through SHPO, they have also looked at Brooklyn, Nassau, and Suffolk. I'm missing anything? And those counties were handled by other consulting firms. So I'm sure they have looked at, I know we've looked at Gowanus as part of previous studies, and so is a lot of other folks like Gregory. But in terms of Newtown Creek, the Queen side of it, we have, we surveyed neighborhoods like Long Island City that border Newtown Creek, and although we didn't identify any historic districts, we certainly identified a lot of individual resources in Hunters Point, Long Island City.
Can I see those someplace?
Yeah, one place to see them is, I think the reason why we're using this Trimble software is because it allows the State Historic Preservation Office to automatically upload that information into their CRIS system, Cultural Resources Information System, which you can find online. But, we can also provide you with our survey data from Long Island City, for example. If you get in touch with us, we can send you what we collected at both the reconnaissance level and then what SHPO selected for us to document at the intensive level. Yeah.
I was just curious about your thoughts about the Trimble software itself. And were there any issues in terms of whether it operates better under certain conditions, or was it pretty consistent for you?
It basically, so basically it operates a lot better if you have Wi-Fi. So sometimes, obviously, when we're out in this doing our site visits, we don't always have Wi-Fi. So sometimes we're having to run into a local coffee shop, find a Starbucks, I don't know, somewhere where we can get local Wi-Fi. So I think that's kind of one of the issues we've come across. But you are able to change those little orange dots where you pin them. We sometimes have to, change that when we're back in the office because we'll connect to our Wi-Fi. So I think that's probably the biggest issue. And then because we're working on a couple different iPads as well, sometimes we have to get the advanced license because we do to just get uploaded things, sent to SHPO quicker that we can carry over from our intensive forms because those surveys, unfortunately, depending on what iPad you're working on and what email you're connected to, you can only get those surveys that you've done on those iPads. So you're not always able to access it unless you're working on a computer, but you're not able to change those surveys while you're on your computer, only on your iPad.
I would say, though, that they're working right now to improve it, because it has been a little buggy compared to other options, like Fulcrum, I think, is generally preferred, but we're kind of stuck with Trimble because it's what SHPO uses. But they have been working to create a new version of it that's supposed to be a lot easier to work with.
So the actual documentation seems to be fine, but it's when you need to transfer the data, that's the issue.
Yeah, it just gets a little bit more complicated and a little bit more time consuming, but it still works really well, and especially with storing all the data that we have to store in terms of doing the Recon and the intensive forms. It's a great platform.
Can you talk a little about the sort of challenges of recognizing intangible culture and heritage when you're doing these sort of windshield surveys? That there's some places that are significant for cultural reasons or for historic reasons that might not immediately pop out.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a challenge with reconnaissance level surveys. I mean, I think that's why, starting out with a historic context that's well researched and draws from local knowledge, takes into consideration previous surveys, is important. And then, the fact that we can revisit and update information, based on conversations with local historians and research that comes up after the fact. But I mean, for sure, there's always going to be some resources that your research just doesn't get there, and there was nothing from the exterior to indicate. So that's always going to happen to some extent, but we certainly strive to avoid that through research and outreach.
Can you give us the complete website for this information to go online to follow it up with Wi-Fi?
Do you mean the SHPO's Cultural Resources Information System? Yeah. And that would include our data and everything else that the State Historic Preservation Office has basically in their files as being eligible or listed. Is it chris.ny?
NYC.gov.
Well, no.
No,
it's-
not
Parks.ny.gov.
What is it?
Chris, CRIS .parks .ny.gov. Yeah, and you can sign in as a guest.
Thank you.
I wonder if you could kind of help us understand the motivation behind this work. So is SHPO wanting this information so that ultimately more resources end up on the National Register, because then when the next storm strikes, FEMA will do the right thing by those resources?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think they're trying to avoid a situation like post-Sandy, like I described when they were, working for the Governor's Office of Storm Recovery, when these things are just being done so quickly, and at that point, there isn't really an opportunity to recognize cultural landmarks because there's not really an opportunity for research. You're just making these really sort of superficial judgments, just due to the kind of nature of the thing. So yes, I think SHPO was trying to take a proactive approach by doing kind of a more systematic and thorough survey of resources in the flood zone.
Is any of it potentially then to design preventive actions to better protect these resources in advance of the next Sandy?
Potentially, yeah. I mean, I think in New York City, the neighborhoods were chosen almost entirely just based on their location within the flood zone. But as part of this second project that includes some upstate municipalities, they were primarily chosen because of their participation in the New York Rising project, in part. So it's sort of they were chosen in part because these communities have already elected to work proactively towards, better relief management, schemes for future storm events. So this kind of just fits in to that larger picture.
Are you guys playing any role in the development of the wedge certification process?
No, I don't know a lot about
Aware
that.
of the wedge survey?
No. Can you enlighten us?
The Wedge is a Waterfront Alliance initiative, waterfront edge design guidelines that looks to acquaint people with how to build sustainably if they are going to develop. It's not pro-development, but it's a matter of getting people to understand what should be done to build sustainably.
And they do seem like they could use a little historic education.
Interesting.
Highly recommend that you guys
Yeah.
help them
Reach
out.
out.
in some way.
Yeah.
Could you briefly talk about the South Street Seaport in phase 2 and what's planned for that and when?
Yeah, and I think we have more outreach to do on the South Street Seaport. You know, what we've done so far is written a new historic context statement and adjusted the period of significance from National Register's point of view in consultation with the State Historic Preservation Office. So now we expect that the period of significance will extend through the 1960s. So with that in mind, we're looking at each building and each feature in the current district. I think we've determined that we're not planning to change the boundaries of the National Register Historic District, but it's not a done deal yet, so it'd be good to get folks' thoughts. But essentially looking at, taking a fresh look at the buildings and assessing their contributing status, whether they contribute to the historic district or not.
Speaking as a Westchester resident, we don't think of ourselves as living upstate.
I know. I actually live north of you now, so.
Bad people, I know, but I'm interested to know which areas you will, if you already are working or will be working on in Westchester.
Yeah.
And what historical societies you'll be dealing with to get this information.
Yeah. Okay. The contract for the second phase was sort of delayed by the state. So we may not be able to finish the entire scope of work before the federal funding runs out. That said, the municipalities in Westchester that are part of the kind of potential study area for this project are New Rochelle, Pelham, all the Pelhams, Larchmont, Mamaroneck, Rye, Portchester.
Okay, so it is the Sound Shore right up the coast of Connecticut.
Yeah.
You haven't started that yet?
We have.
That's the area where I live, so I'm interested to know who you're working with and what you're doing.
We have mostly just been focusing on New Rochelle for our first municipality there. And it's been a doozy. There's a lot in New Rochelle. Where do you live?
I grew up in New Rochelle, and now I'm in the town of Rye, Portchester.
Ah, let's be in touch. Yeah, I'd love to talk to you about New Rochelle. Yeah.
And I think that your work is important not from a protection standpoint, but from an historical documentation standpoint. I think a lot of these areas, 50 years from now, will just be a living memory, and you're going to be able to contribute to that living memory. Broad Channel will be underwater, and without your documentation, very few people will remember what it was. And similarly, with certain other areas around the city.
Yeah, Jamaica Bay is, such a changing landscape, and, even with the survey, sometimes we go back and look at Google Street View to double check areas that we'd been, we visited already, and I'd see something and say, oh no, we missed that. And then we'd look and it's gone now, like things that are pre and post Sandy. It's just such a dramatic difference in Jamaica Bay.
Right.
So yeah, it's a challenge figuring out how to really document and appreciate those maritime communities that don't have.
Absolutely. And storms will be the least of our problems. It will be the rising waters that are going to be the real
problem.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our panelists. Lunch downstairs, 1 o'clock to 1:30, and then, you know, we start up again.
I have one question for the audience.
I know. Elizabeth has some questions.
More information about the WIC program?
Yes, I
I can
would.
put you in touch.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I just wrote it down, but. Great, yeah.
Take a photo of us.
Okay.
So where'd you grow up in New Rochelle?
Oh.
Bring it in. Someone's far away, they can mail it.
Okay, I grew up in the North.
Thank you.
And this is the land of, you know.
Yeah. Well, I went to third day, but I did not like
So you take these old beach slopes, which were starting to run down, and it's a lot of property right there.
Yeah, it is scary. Yeah, no. And I'm like, yeah, I stuff, yeah, I'll just
Yeah.
work at the state.
But now it's just
Yeah, I'm like in between like historic preservation to like.
Even with the software.
Local.
Well,
Yeah, and I feel like that's a bit more marketable. Yeah, because you don't know what to, like, if you do your Google search and you do all that, but you don't really know what it's like until you get out there, and then you're like, find that here, so. That might just be it, I went out there, and we were kind of like, okay, there's these cool streets that look, and then we got there, we were like, oh no, there's so much. Yeah. And we did like 3 times. Yeah.
neighborhoods were showing.
And I'm from yeah, but I always know fun exploring. Very more exploring because like Stony Brook is really? Yeah.
Well, we will be very soon.
You don't know if you're there.
A flurry of activity.
Oh, I didn't know that.
It has to, that's.
No, you say soon, I thought.
No, I think it's really interesting that they're, you know,
Oh, well, we will
like
be continuing
kinds of
survey.
I like some of
New Rochelle.
really industrial, you know, it's like
The
a
summer
Yeah,
story.
more and that's just like.
When do you start the sound?
We've started it.
Forward now,
We
you know?
a draft.
But I like I can take it.
No, I know.
Okay,
Yeah, but they were walking from us.
5,000 years ago, it's a lot better right now.
Oh,
Yeah, how did you go back?
Was
Do you
that
have,
all that
I
was?
live in,
Or
you live in
the rest were just so
yeah, I think,
Oh, wow.
and how did you go about like
To
getting?
me, it's
And
to
then
save
it's
us
that, and
information.
it's, but it's.
You know, we're working 250 Water Street right
Well,
now.
I was saying,
It's
like,
like
you
a
have
threat
storments,
because,
had floods,
Howard Hughes
and you also
Corporation
have to
took
go
it over
in and
and
completely altering them, and you know,
Yeah.
final siting, because
they
they
want
want.
to build high.
Yeah,
So
so it's
they
just.
want to
But they
get
still
a
have this
rezoning so
place,
that they
like,
can
when you
transfer
go,
airways.
so that's just kind of one of the
South
things that we're starting to really dive into.
When you say it's a block of
Maybe we need to
4
look at other
homes,
modes,
it's blocks.
you know, on the conservation side.
It's a tiny thing.
That, you know, incorporate
Huge
more.
building,
Like,
but
my
it's
job, and
just,
I'm really focused on
again,
like,
the shadow and
detail.
really alter
Why is this going into a new
what
interesting phase of
right
preservation
now
for
is
sure?
spending
More of like
on
getting preservation policy.
huge low rise.
Yeah.
So I'm very much invested in this. I don't know, you know, if they contact or how it's.
Yeah, I'd love to get in touch.
Like they, you know, they allocated X amount to different shippos, the shippos that are there. Decided how they wanted to use those funds. Like I know some, Connecticut, they, New York ship was only, it's only been building, so. I think once this funding runs out, I think that west, that's what we're on. I mean, I don't know, but I don't think there's another phase.
No.
I know.
I think that's the last of it.
So, but you have the funding for resiliency every phase, or is it really
Yeah.
just the utility center?
No, we have the funding.
But it has a timeline of when it runs out, right?
The state so long to execute this contract that some of the areas had to prioritize. Like, for instance, in Westchester, we figured we had started our shell because there's so much development pressure, and the city has actually incentivized planning process, site plan, so streamlined. There's so much activity, so like, okay, you may not get funding. I mean, well, let's at least get ones where there's
They've got an
like
amazing
happy,
website.
you know,
Our role, or else we lose everything else.
inside the district, but like a master.
It's just a mess.
It is what it is. Work as fast as you can to get as much done as where we are.
Right, and what is the?
Well, for the
Phase one, this one is
That's
middle of, it's like end of this month, phase one, but we're just wrapping that up now. Like,
Oh, you are?
Yeah, we're doing the last bit of intensive forms, having SHPO review those, but that's basically done, but I think.
phase two is September.
Yeah, so it'll be here before we know it.
Yeah, that actually.
That's 6 months away.
Yeah, and we've only had it for only a couple months since we got it, but we were still working on phase one, so.
On everything.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of time. I think there's about 3 people. Our main people that we go to are like Kathy and Chelsea.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, those are the main 2 people we
Do
work
they
with.
have a lot of time set aside for doing this?
That's the thing, like, if they get big projects in, yeah, Paul.
Dedicated to this left. So
Yeah.
Chelsea, I think is probably working on
Chelsea's,
different hats.
yeah.
That's originally, I think, part of the funding. I'm guessing that they got it. The micro level was to hire someone. So I was the Allegheny, so that person's left, so I don't.
Right, so it's just,
Replace that position.
right, so it's just basically Chelsea and Kathy, but Paul was like really helpful. And his main project was to Richmond, this survey, so. Yeah, they have a lot.
Yeah, the kind of peers.
Yeah, the fact that they have to review at the Recon level and then the intensive level, they have a lot of stuff on their plate too.
They're woefully always understaffed. I probably know.
There's always Gene, I should say.
Want me to write really nice?
Great.
Do you do a lot of work with Shingle or is it mostly landmarks?
No, I'm doing national nomination.
Somebody who would have clients. And you guys.
It's former state, she's 2 generations. It's driven by the citizens of the environment. Yeah, and they want to do this. They come from Jersey, you've got the state, but for some reason, the reviewer is more disloyal to it too. Talking about the shutdown, I'm like, the shutdown is important. Yes.
We're like, really, you need a hard copy of this? Can I like just put it on a file transfer site and just pick it off like other people, or I throw it in I'm happy to make your
Oh, this is great.
Thank you.
Look forward to pulling it up actually on Christmas.
Yeah, there you go, exactly.
I can't take it easy. I grew up in Elmhurst.
Cameron, you happen to notice these mics?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, I think you have to hold it. Can you pretend it's like a, basically like a mic?
Yeah, but yeah, no, I didn't see a clip for it, unfortunately, so, but it works well.
Yeah, it did.
You'll see Molly and her crew wandering around.
Monday is Parks Avenue.
It's interesting, it's so many questions on the technology.
I know a few weeks ago,
Really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. Really nice to meet you. I would not. I was at the FDC. Yeah, that's where we were.
I know our families.
Okay. Oh, nice. Yeah,
Which is changing when I'm there. Well, no, they
yeah. Oh, okay. Oh, no. Yeah, I'm like right near there. No, yeah. Thank you.
You don't need a best interest in it.
Usually it's the best interest side, but people were interested.
Explainable. It's kind of complicated. Like, it's not a complicated software, but it'd be easier if I was like running through, like going through on the iPad, but
It can be tedious to explain something.
really appreciate it. Like a software
It
program.
really can,
Yeah.
you know, reading on Microsoft, it can be.
Yeah.
But
Unless you're
trying
doing it
to
yourself.
check in.
Yeah.
Everything comes back.
Your tongue.
Goes to bed at night.
Yeah, I was like, you have a good.
Wakes up in the morning.
She here? I don't think she's here. I used to see her, like, she used to work at the, I think she works to something, HDC. She wants to go to archaeology. You're selling her on it? Do it. No, we were commiserating that there's no local MA program anymore. Where is Hunter shut down there? Yeah. Yeah, it sucks. I think it was not enough students.
Josh was super strong.
No, he wasn't in Hunter, he was in the grad school. Well, I think you guys did an awesome job. It was a nice audience, people were interested. Yeah, that was a good. Yeah, I was glad with our turnout. And good questions. Yeah, very good questions. And and Waterfront Alliance. That dude's a little nutty. That guy? Yeah. The other guy. The one that sends those.
He fell asleep at night.
Yeah. Oh, I saw him sleep. He's the one that sends
He
those
came to
weird
AKRF for a
emails. He's gonna
presentation.
send an
It was
email
just-
summary of your.
He sat there, there was only like
I don't know if you get them.
15 of us,
And he just slept.
you know, talking, and he sort of. And he's- Like, Peter, you fall asleep again, come on.
Yeah, I saw him like. Did he fall asleep here? Yeah, I saw him. No, he was out.
Well, I guess I'll take it personally based on that history, right?
Yeah. Who was the guy who was asking all the questions? I was trying to give you his contact. Lots of metro cards.
Bag comes out of his.
You're literally a bag lady. Bag of birdseed, I I liked his
You don't want to
tie-dye
have
shirt.
downstairs with preservation people.
I think whatever people want to. We go somewhere with alcohol. I mean, we can go by through there and see if we recognize anybody to do a quick schmooze. I'm game for whatever everyone wants to do. I was like, well, it would be nice if we could get lunch and drinks or whatever. I'm fine with whatever.
This is your tribe here, so.
This is your tribe. Sorry, no, I cheated.
She asked me a question. I said, are you an archaeologist?
Oh,
She didn't know I'm an archaeologist. I got it.
Great. Brought out. Like, update.
this yours?
This is mine. I'm Liz.
All right, cool. My name's Matt. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Matt.
Will you be the first one presenting?
I believe so.
I'm not sure if this is the only...
I think I might be the only.
Okay.
Yes.
We have a folder with all the presentations that we received today.
Great.
That is also open for you.
Okay.
Testing 1, 2. Would you like this in full screen for you?
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds great.
All right. All right. Do you have any video or audio embedded?
I do have audio. I think it's about near the end. And video, actually.
Cool.
Hey, it works. That's excellent.
All right. And I'll leave that up for you. You also have your slide advancer.
Oh, okay. So it's not just the.
You can use the keyboard as well,
Okay.
or the mouse.
So this one's forward.
Yep.
Great.
Right is forward, left is back.
Fantastic.
There's a laser pointer on top. That's the red button.
Nice.
This guy right
Yeah,
there.
I see that.
Yeah. If it doesn't activate your video,
Uh-huh.
you might have to scroll over the play button.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll figure it out.
Okay. If you do need anything, we can be reached at me and my colleague at 2111.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. No. 301. I didn't do 302.
You're all set, Liz?
We're all set. Oh, is it? Yeah. Got a couple layers on, so I didn't notice. it's on the opposite side from us, so if you go sort of here, around,
I went
around
that
and
way and I
left.
didn't see it.
Maybe
I didn't go far enough.
Maybe. And this starts at 1:45.
Yeah.
I have 2 whole minutes. I think I'm gonna run to the bathroom too.
I hope I'm not your whole audience.
I hope that too. If so, it'll be a nice conversation. Welcome.
I remember you from last year, you spoke.
Oh, that's right, I did.
enjoyed it
Oh, good.
so much. I'm Debbie Cox, I'm
Sure.
a press historian.
Oh.
Nice to meet you.
You were game.
You enjoying today?
Yes.
I am too.
And we're, this is a detour from advocacy and agitation. This is contemplation.
Oh, and true. Right?
Hi.
How are
Hey,
you?
this is gonna be great. The fewer the people, the more opportunity for questions.
Well, not only that, it's time to
Left
sit
my
down.
water bottle down there.
Ah.
Drinking that water bottle.
Now, when they made funny to record an oral history, I've done it already. Did you ever get involved in an oral history project? NYPL has been doing it throughout every district. Yeah, it's pretty great.
And what happens to all of those recordings?
Well, my recording is at the Harlem Library at 135th Street, and it involves civil rights activist, last lover of Bayard Rustin, who wrote for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I'm up for an award, I guess,
Well,
because
good for
the
you.
count. Well, you know what?
Award from whom?
From the library, they've been reviewing, but you know what? I don't care about an award, I'm glad they took it and can educate. That's the important
They
thing.
put it online?
No, you have to go there and request it.
No. That's kind of bad news,
Well,
not to have it online. For the simple reason that 50 years from now, that's where everything's gonna be. If it's not online, it won't exist.
well, right now, it's not. It could be eventually.
Or you could set up your own blog or website. Preserve it for a long time. Whoever sat in this chair was a very, very tall person.
I'm Liz. Hi, Liz. This is the oral history workshop. I have put out helpful oral history and preservation manuals in like the front 2 rows. So if you're shy, you can grab one from the front row and go to the back row, or you can just come sit in the front row.
I think I'm just going to get started and hope that people trickle in. It's good that we have a small group because that means we can do a lot more like conversing with one another and sort of sharing ideas on what each of you are working on and would like to work on. So to start, I should get my notes out.
But my name is Liz Strong. I'm the oral history program manager for the New York Preservation Archive Project. And the goal of today's workshop is really just to introduce you to oral history, why it is such a powerful tool in the historic preservation movement, and to give you some tools specifically to get started on oral history projects of your own. So I mentioned the manuals that I have out in the first 2 rows that have a lot of details on what I'm going to talk about today. I encourage you to grab them and bring them home with you. Not least of all because if you take them, I don't have to carry them home with me.
But also because they are a great way to get started. Also, I've put out a sign-up sheet. So for those of you who are interested in seriously considering or definitely starting an oral history project of your own, please, please, please write down your name and your email address. We want to share further resources with you. We want to stay in touch. Our goal is to make sure that preservationists are out there documenting their own history. So that's kind of some housekeeping to begin with. Since we are such a small group, would you guys just go around, tell me your name, your neighborhood or historic site in particular that you are interested in, and what brought you to this workshop so I can make sure to gear what I say today to your interests. Let's just start on this side of the room, not to put you on the spot.
No problem. My name's Keith Taylor. I live in Central Harlem. We're actually trying to designate an area around 135th and St. Nicholas and just north of 2 blocks east as a new state federal historic district. And I came to understanding that having individuals from that area that speak about the history of the area would be very helpful in terms of trying to get perhaps city landmark. So it would be appropriate to find out how to do so.
Great. Yeah.
Louis Kleiman, I'm on staff with the Waterfront Alliance, and our interests are basically 700 miles of coastal shorelines around New York City, but also New Jersey and Connecticut, and I am interested in the basic history of those shorelines.
Got it.
Hi, I'm Debbie Cops, and I'm also a resident of Central Harlem. Yo. I've done 1 oral history project already. Bayard Rustin's last lover was Walter Nagel. He handles the Rustin Foundation. I interviewed him, and boy, oh boy, was that a treasure. So I'm somewhat familiar, but as the first gentleman says, we still need more preservation in Central Harlem. We've begun to do it, and I think oral history is a good idea. I do tours as a tour guide historian, and people don't necessarily read all the time, so oral is a good vehicle. And somebody asked, this gentleman asked me, are the oral histories accessible online or just where can
Through our organization? Yes, fully accessible online.
Okay.
So I'll get into that a little bit in the presentation, but we have over 100 oral histories in our collection. About 100 of them are available online. The rest are available upon request, and that just has to do with copyright eccentricities. Okay. But they're all available for people to use.
Great thing.
Yeah. Yes.
Hi, I'm Lei, and I'm a junior preservation architect, and I'm interested in this oral history workshop because I'm interested in seeking for a way to preserve the memories of Chinese American histories of this country.
Great. And in the back?
My name is Peter Feynman. I write a blog on the state of New York State history. That includes some of these things. And also where I live, we're creating an historical society, and I think in Westchester, which is not upstate. And one way to reach out to the community as a project might be to invite them to participate in some kind of oral history project.
Yeah, oral history is great for outreach
Way of
efforts.
introducing ourselves to the community.
Yeah,
Way to engage them.
absolutely. Jeffrey, do you want to?
I'm Jeff Kressler. I'm on the board of the Historic Districts Council. I'm also the librarian at John Jay College of Criminal Justice.
Got it.
Hi, Nancy DeFrancesco, Upper West Side, specifically the Lincoln Square area. Longtime member of Municipal Art Society in Landmark West, and fascination with architecture and the environment, and better at English major, so I believe in the power of story.
Fantastic.
My name is Penelope Barrow. I'm a member of the board of the Historic Districts Council, a former member of the Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation when it was starting its oral history project. Apart from that, I'm here out of general interest.
Great.
I'm Andy Sosin. I live in the South Street Seaport District and in Southbridge Towers particularly, which is coming up on its 50th anniversary. And so we are embarking on a 50th anniversary project, and part of that includes oral history.
Fantastic. And Jesse, I assume you're here to keep me on time.
Yes, please.
Okay.
But I am, if you don't know me, I am Jesse. I'm on the staff of the Historic Districts Council, and I live in Washington Heights.
Great. So to get started, I just want to tell you a little bit about who we are, the New York Preservation Archive Project, in case you're not already familiar. We were founded in 1998. We document and celebrate the history of the preservation movement in New York City. So the way we do this is we record oral histories to capture the memories of influential preservationists. We rescue threatened historic records and help place them with permanent archival institutions. We provide training, assistance, and support to preservation not-for-profits to help them become better curators of their own records in history. And we bring these records and stories to life through public programs and accessible resources. So, preservation history, the history of what all of you are working on, is incredibly important. But it has some unique challenges associated with trying to document it and hold on to it in the long term. It's most often carried in individuals' memories rather than published written records. Preservationists themselves are often concerned first and foremost with their work and may not take the time to record their history. So, in addressing these challenges, oral history is a particularly strong tool. It's good at filling gaps in written records and integrating personal memories with public knowledge. So what oral history is essentially, it's just a recorded conversation that preserves someone's unique memories and makes a contribution from that conversation to a collective history. So in order to conduct an oral history, you need a few key elements. You need someone with valuable memories and experiences. I call this person a narrator. You need to make a recording of those valuable memories and experiences, and you need to make that recording available as a resource to others. So I know we kind of went around already. Some of you have already done oral histories, but just by show of hands, how many of you already attempted to record an oral history interview of some kind? Did you make that oral history available for others to listen to, or are you currently just holding on to it? What's...
About 2.5 years ago, the NYPL did an extensive recording, and there was in all the districts I was involved in single.
Yeah, that was a great project, and I think
I was
they've closed
shocked.
it down now.
I know, that's what I wanted to ask you. Do you know if it's online? I think it's just within the library, right?
Some of it is online, some of it is. I know that for a fact because the Preservation Archive Project partnered with them to do some in Staten Island, and that project is available online. That was the Sandy Ground Oral Histories.
Okay.
I believe others are as well. If you go to New York Public Library, I think it's like /oral history, you can find a page that has all their little collection. You pull it up on your phone right there. Okay, great. So some of you have some training for this as well that you got through the library.
If you don't mind my asking, if you're familiar with their format, are you going to offer it any differently with equipment and what you want to have said, or will it be similar?
So it's very different from what the New York Public Library does. What they do is or what they did, is they trained volunteers. I think their priority was to get volunteers in the neighborhoods where they wanted the oral histories collected. And then folks just went out, gathered them, brought them back to the collection. We are a very small organization. We have one full-time staff member and a website. The rest of us are contractors, interns, fellows, students. We sort of cobble it together that way. So rather than doing, a mass training with volunteers and sending everyone out into the field to come back to a collective archive, what we're really trying to do is just seed the tools that you guys need to run your own oral history projects out in the community. And part of the reason we want to stay in touch is because in the absence of the New York Public Library and programs like it, we'd like to do more, but we haven't established an official program to do more than this just now. But this year we will be doing more workshops like this around the city in the hopes that preservationists will record their own histories. The other thing that makes us different is the New York Public Library was focused just on community histories in general, the history of a place. We are focused on the history of the preservation movement. So any oral histories we collect are with people who have been involved in preservation campaigns, or they've been involved particularly in a site that has been landmarked and they have some important history about it. That's really the line we walk, is just preservation. So yeah.
Does it have to be a first-person narrative? I mean, I have a lot of friends who are no longer with us who were involved with Penn Station, for example, and I know their stories, but it's not first person. I'm just repeating what I've heard.
Oh, that's a great question. One of the things oral history is very strong at is being that primary source of a witness, of somebody who was directly there. But in the absence of that, if there really is no written record of those memories, I highly recommend that you either write them down or you make a recording. The thing that makes oral history unique is that you are working with an interviewer. So, it's a simple thing for someone like yourself who has these memories to go and make the record yourself. For it to be an oral history, there needs to be another person there who's sort of helping make it with you in dialogue, and that gives you the freedom to just kind of remember while they're keeping track of the structure and the follow-up questions and all of that sort of thing. But just because it is an oral history doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It sounds like you've got a gold mine and you should work on preserving it.
Well, everybody knows Penn Station. I don't know how much for gold mine.
I'm in the process of preserving a block in Harlem. I'm at not the rudimentary level. I've been working on this for over a year. Is that something also what it takes to finally preserve and what you go through? Is that something of interest rather than just oral history?
What do you mean? Like, would we do an oral history with someone like you who has a campaign in progress, or are you?
Well, I'm asking a format of what does it take to preserve something in like segments until because it will be done, but to see segments and the completion.
So we do have oral histories with preservation campaigns that are ongoing, with preservation campaigns that have succeeded and preservation campaigns that have failed. We even have some oral histories with folks who were able to save a site, but not necessarily by having it made a historic landmark. They may have used other means. So we do kind of think outside the box in that way, but it doesn't necessarily mean we'll be able to get every single oral history that we think is a good fit, if that answers your question.
You'd have to have someone present the concept before you'd say, yes, we're interested.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And the sad truth is we'd have to have somebody present the concept, say, yes, we're interested, and then we'd have to go find the funding to actually get it done. So again, the goal today is to make sure that everybody has the tools at their fingertips to do it themselves. And if you ever have a question about where can this be saved? Could you find a way to put it on your website? Can you recommend another archive? We want you to be in touch with us. So definitely, follow up. We have our contact information in these manuals, which are around the room. We also have a free PDF of this online to download. So if there are people you want to share it with who aren't here, grab an extra copy, but also send them the link. Okay, so moving along, I touched on this a little bit at the beginning in response to a question, but this is sort of what we have in our oral history archive. We have over 100 oral histories that are currently available online. All the oral histories that we collect, we try to make them available for researchers to access. We also make use of them during public programs, educational events, and the goal is to help people within the movement to learn from the past and to provide them with the resources that support their outreach and advocacy. So in a workshop I did at the last HDC conference, the consortium conference, we had somebody share that when he recorded an oral history, it directly helped with funding for the site, it directly helped with explaining to people outside of his organization why this place was so important, because he had that first person knowledge. So not only are recording these oral histories helpful to preservationists themselves because it passes the information of the campaign forward, it helps avoid reinventing the wheel, it connects groups that would not otherwise have been aware of each other. It's also great for external advocacy, letting people know why this site matters, what went into saving it. And also, as you mentioned, if you are trying to rally a community around preserving a site, getting them involved in recording their own oral histories is a way to strengthen your outreach, get them to feel ownership within your campaign and your organization, as well as to get them to not feel ownership over the site, because already people who live in an area feel ownership over it, but to help them really feel involved in preserving and advocating for its history. So it's great on all those levels, and that's part of why we want to make these tools for conducting oral histories available. So what I'm going to try to do is just go through some of the really practical concerns in planning an oral history project. On a very basic level, as I said before, an oral history is meeting with somebody, making a recording, making that recording available. But there's a lot that goes into just that simple act. So when you're beginning, when you have somebody in mind that you want to interview, or maybe a series of people in mind that you want to interview, set clear goals for the project from that very, very beginning time. Think about whose stories are missing from the historical record and how best to reach those people. Think about the resources you have available, and that will help you set your priorities. Have an idea of who your ideal audience is for these oral histories and how best to reach those people. Who's going to listen to the oral history once you get it? I encourage you to start small. Experience is the best teacher. You can always adjust as you go. A lot of times people have a gargantuan project in their mind, and it's so big and so important it keeps them from getting started. Start with one person, learn from your mistakes, learn from your successes, go from there, get other people involved. Preliminary research. So find out what information is already readily available about the subject you'd like to document. Look at existing records, press, and publication. When I say, think about whose stories are missing, that comes from research. Know whose stories are already documented and whose stories are already told well. Oral history is really strong at filling in those gaps. It takes a lot of effort and groundwork. So focus on those areas where there are some voices and experiences that haven't already been documented. And then try to talk to people with direct connections and experience who can make recommendations. So maybe you already know somebody who was involved in this preservation campaign, or who has direct experience with the site you'd like to document, but they might not be the best person to talk about its history. They might be the best person to talk to first and get recommendations. Who's been involved the longest, who's the best storyteller on the record, who represents this well. Having those ground connections is really, really powerful from day one. And then finding potential narrators. As I've said, oral history is a especially useful tool for preserving histories that have not already been documented in any other way. And so for that reason, most oral history projects prioritize reaching narrators who are not well known, have not been interviewed previously, and have not published articles or books on their specific perspective on historical events. This is a core strength of oral history, but it also means that making initial contacts with narrators and conducting preliminary research can be more complicated than if they were already public figures. So again, direct referrals and recommendations will be the strongest way to get in touch. Are there any questions at this point? I'm blowing through it kind of quickly.
Just one question.
Yeah.
Do you use photographs to back up the oral history?
We do whenever we can. Our organization, because we're focused on historic preservation and sites, we try to get portraits of the narrators on the day of the interview. But if they're not interested in that, or if we're not able to, we always put up a picture of the site they worked on as well.
No, yeah, well, I didn't mean it that way, but I meant historical photos of the area in which they are discussing.
If they have photographs, we love to get copies of them. But another main mission of our organization, as I mentioned before, is just rescuing important documents. So if somebody has a great collection of photographs of the site that they're just keeping in a shoebox under their bed, that would be interesting to us for other reasons. We'd want to help them get connected with an archive if that interests them. You had a question in the back.
Well, actually, before I ask that, you're saying the oral history is not just audio.
The oral history as we do it is just audio. Sometimes when we have the funding to do video, we will. But again, because oral history is so good at outreach, and because the people we are targeting are preservationists themselves, if they have records and photographs that are worth preserving, oral history is kind of a good way to like meet them, get in their home, get to know them, see what they have, and then follow up and say, hey, by the way, do you have a plan for your records? And if you don't, would you like one? Can we help you with that?
No, the reason why I'm asking is our village birthday is in May. So let's say we try to reach out, we want to start taking not preservation sites, but community preservation in a way, preserve the community history through oral history. I was just thinking of, we were somehow taping that, and I was going to ask you if you're going to come to how do you really, and what do you need, what space do you need?
For the recording itself?
Yeah, when you get down to the practicality, let's say I want to start with the mayor. That'd be, you know, is it in a big room like this, or there are other people around? You need a private recording room, like a radio station type thing. I wasn't thinking of physical objects, because then that adds a video component as well, which I guess gets to your cost issue.
There are so many different ways to handle that question, and that's part of why I say set your goals and priorities from the beginning, because otherwise you'll get pulled on a million different rabbit holes. So if you know that documenting objects or a physical space are important to your project, then you'll know you need to raise funds to get a videographer involved. And I do recommend getting a videographer involved if you want to do video, because you know sometimes these little handheld cameras are trying to catch it on your phone will be such a terrible recording, it was a waste of everyone's time to try and record it. So my priority is getting a good, clean audio recording where you can clearly hear the narrator speaking and you can clearly hear the interviewer speaking. That on a basic level is really what you need. In order to get that good, clear audio recording, your safest bet is to be just the two of you in a quiet room. That's not to say you can't do oral history with multiple people, but you need a much more experienced interviewer who can kind of help organize it so that people aren't talking over each other and you're not losing people's words.
So if you try to do it at the birthday celebration, that's probably not a good location.
Well, unless you have incredible recording equipment.
Well, or we can take them to the separate room in the village hall where we.
Yeah. No, I see where you're going. You know, sometimes if there are community events where people who usually aren't accessible will be there, it's a great opportunity to grab them, go aside. The downside of that is it means your interviews are going to be very, very short.
Like the ones they're doing out in the hallway now with the.
Yeah, right. So I wouldn't say that a short interview, like a 30-second interview, would rise to the level of an oral history, because there are so many different types of of interviews to do. Oral history is just one. The thing that sets oral history aside is that it is primarily a historical record. You know, it is akin to these papers that you find, you know, primary source documents in archives. What makes oral history different is that it's a person's memory. It's not a publication. It's not personal correspondence. It's not a journal memory. It's not a journal entry. It's a person's memory. And so in order for a future researcher to completely understand what that person means when they are talking, or the context of how they remember things a certain way, they really need the time to understand who that person is. Where are they from? What experiences have informed their opinion? You know, they may be an expert on a particular subject, but they also have some opinions. And the researcher needs to know, are those well-informed opinions? What is shaping those opinions? How is this going to be remembered differently today than it will be 5 years from now, 10 years from now, or you know, the day that it happened? So in order to make a source that is that rich and has all the information and context that a researcher will need to interpret the subject matter, You need an hour at least. I usually do about 2-hour interviews. Yeah.
You just start to hit on the topic.
And then you edit it.
Nope, not at all.
On the full 2 hours?
Yeah, because as I said, the researcher needs that information. You don't always know what the oral history is going to be used for. It might be used for a radio piece, in which case they'll edit it, they'll fact check it, they'll do all the things that StoryCorps does. But it might be used by a linguist. It might be used by, you know, the grandson of the person who spoke, who's trying to piece this history back together, and every little thing, the ums, the ahs, the way they speak is going to be valuable to that person. You just don't know what's going to be valuable. So you get as much context as you can, you make it available, and hope for the best. I'm so sorry you got cut off.
Just answered my question,
2 hours is the longest you can go before people really start to wonder when you're going to leave.
Unedited. Right? Unedited, straight.
Unedited straight.
Okay.
Yeah. And again, from that point, you can do whatever you want with it. You know, we make documentaries, we make little promotional things, we make audio clips, we put them on social media, we do all sorts of things. But an oral history itself is that raw information.
Then you'll take those, I'm sorry, I broke it.
That's all right.
And then you'll take those oral histories at their face value? Or if you're looking at a particular area, then try to compare other oral histories to see if they match up?
That's actually a wonderful way to do oral history, is to get many different perspectives on a particular topic in the hopes that people will sort of listen to all of them and form an opinion based on that. You had a question. Really? All right.
You know, so then the narrator is not really confronting the interviewee, saying, you're all wrong in what you just said. You're just gathering the information from the
You mean the interviewer isn't necessarily like contesting what the narrator may or may not say?
No, the narrator is not contesting what the interviewer is saying. The narrator's job is to gather the information from the person being interviewed.
The narrator is the person being interviewed, but I see what you're saying.
Oh, I'm confusing what you
Yeah, sorry. So the narrator is the person with the expertise. They're the witness. The interviewer is the one who's conducting the interview.
So the interviewer is just gathering information from the subject.
That can be complicated, and again, that's why it's wonderful to have an interviewer with expertise and training, is because sometimes you'll want to let a person go off and say whatever they say, whether or not it's factually true, because you see there's value in that statement for some other context. But then sometimes you really do need to challenge people because you'll get better quality information. And it's hard to explain when you know the difference. So for example, I did an interview with somebody who had a particular political opinion, and sharing that for the context of the day could be really, really useful for somebody in the future. But I also need to reveal to that person in the future, does this person have any relevant expertise to form this opinion? Is this really worth listening to? And so in that context, I did challenge them. And not to say you're wrong, but to say, what would you say in response to this issue, and this issue? And in answering those questions, it's revealed that this person doesn't really have any relevant first-person expertise on that subject. And that's helpful to the narrator. But only in that context would you do that. And I know that's a little too technical. But for the most part, if you're a novice interviewer, keep the person on topic. As long as they're speaking on topic, if they don't remember names or dates, if they remember things out of order, don't worry about it. The recorder is going to capture all that information, and you have control over how that information gets made available. So if you need to add addendums, notes, if the narrator says, hey, I got something wrong, I want to fix it, you can always make that audio available with backup materials, saying, hey, by the way, at 14 seconds, they say this, they meant this person's name. At 2 minutes, they say this, that actually happened 4 years earlier, if you choose to, or you can trust that a researcher in the future will do that work. Yes?
If I may make a suggestion based on my experience,
Sure.
having done the interview, a script and outline that you both look over before, it's like a film. So you're somewhat able to coordinate where to let go, where to ask is very helpful.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things I was going to get to next in point number 5 is make a plan. No, it's fine that we're doing this because I want to address your specific goals. That's one of the strengths of having a small group is that I can really get to what you guys need to know.
That's just what the councilman said this morning when he was talking to all of us. Before he interviews somebody for a position, says they go over what they're going to talk about so they know if it's going to be a good interview where I'll approve you for the job, or a bad interview, I won't approve you for the board position even before they get there.
So there are drawbacks and benefits to all of these. One way or another, when you go into an interview, you've already talked with people on the ground, you've already done your research, you've got your notes, you've got your timeline in front of you to guide you. So that's really important that you as the interviewer know the structure. You do have the option to contact the person you're going to interview in advance and say, these are the topics I'd like to ask you about. Did I miss anything? Are there topics that I wasn't able to learn about that you know we should not miss, that absolutely have to be on the record? Or is there anything on this list that you're not comfortable talking about and you don't want to put on the record? Give them that opportunity, it's great. If, however, you send them that full list in advance to review and they come with prepared remarks and they're reading from a script, there is no point to conducting an oral history interview. You could have just done a written correspondence and it would have been equally valuable. So you don't want somebody reading off a script. Also because the value of having an interviewer in that space is that you can think with your understanding of the future audience, what are they going to need to know? So if the narrator is just going like a train on rails saying this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, you might hear something that they don't explain. Or you might hear, a little silence like, okay, that's some context we actually need. They're going to rely on your expertise to let them know when they've done that so that you can jump in and ask a follow-up question and say, actually, we need you to define that term. We need you to define that moment. Not necessarily because I don't know, but because somebody down the line listening is going to want to know. So that dialogue can't really take place if the narrator is too over-prepared. So there's things to win and things to lose in all those cases. But have a plan going in. Follow-up questions are going to be your most valuable questions, because you're going to hear something that you didn't expect you were going to hear, and you need to be able to respond to it. Be prepared to discard or alter your plan if you discover something. You go in there thinking you're going to interview this person about a particular place, and then you find out that they're one of 5 people who was ever present at a completely other event, and you're just like, oh my goodness, I'd be doing history an injustice if I didn't take an extra 20 minutes to ask them this question right now. So be flexible, but have that structure and that plan so that you can give the narrator the freedom to really explore their memories as far as they can.
What you're really saying is you don't want to lose your spontaneity.
Spontaneity helps. And it keeps you on your toes. You really do have to be listening. You can trust the recorder is going to get everything. And if you listen to it later and you're like, oh, I should have asked that question, you can call them up and do another interview if you're able to. But you also really do need to be listening in order to do this right. Number 4 is extremely important, so I don't want to skip past it. The legal release. Without a legal release, you are very limited in what you can actually do with an oral history. When you record somebody's story, you've created a piece of intellectual property that, as far as we know, in terms of what's been tried in case law, belongs to the person you are interviewing. So, if you want to make it available to the public in any means, you're either giving it to an archive, or you're publishing it yourself online, or you're making it part of a public event in some way. That requires them to give you permission to do that thing. It may be a transfer of copyright, it may be a specific permission to use, but either way there has to be something in writing that says they understand what you're going to do with it, and that they're going to let you do it, and that they give you legal permission to do that. I highly recommend having that signed before the recording begins, because it is very difficult to get something signed afterwards. The other benefit of having it signed before the recording begins is it doubles as kind of a consent form. You have completely informed this person before you've put them on the record about how you want to use it. You've made sure they understand how you want to use it, and they agree to using it that way. And again, if you do that before the recording begins, it's great in terms of just convenience, but it's also really good in terms of communication. And then you both have something in writing that says this is what we both agreed to. 2 hands went up. Yes?
I didn't see it in here. Is there a format or a guide?
There is no one format.
but we do have a list of resources where you can find those things. Hang on. Interview agreement forms, page 19. Page 24, types of agreements, informed consent, permission to use, legal release. And then the book that you want to look up is called Oral History in the Law by John A. Neuenschwander. And he has templates.
Templates.
Yes, of all these types of agreements, and he explains them. And again, the reason we don't offer templates in this is because it really depends on the project. They're so unique. But he puts out a new volume every couple years that's sort of updated with his understanding of current case law and kind of says how these different things work and what you can do.
At the barest of minimum, like write something on a napkin that says, yes, I intend for you to be able to use this, because at least that shows intent. Some oral historians who can't put things in writing will at least do it. They'll turn on the tape, they'll say, this is the date, this is my name, this is the narrator's name, this is why we are making this recording, do you verbally consent to that? And they say yes, and then that's a good enough place to start too. So all of this is scalable, but it's not disposable, you have to do it.
So if you get the verbal on the tape, you don't need the written.
The written is so much better. If you can't get the written, at least get the verbal, but get the written.
I don't understand the difference.
So when you look up the resource, Oral History in the Law, you'll see, because there are some things that are a legal transfer of copyright that say you have the permission to publish this online, and then there are some things that are like, you have permission to use this, but I still hold the copyright. It's a difference between like intent and understanding being communicated and an actual legal document being drawn up. So the legal document being drawn up is just making everyone's lives simpler. It's never ambiguous. You can always go back to that person and say, this is what you agreed to. You can always go back to their heirs and say, this is what they agreed to. It's not ambiguous. Usually you don't end up in court. Usually because people doing oral histories are involved with such tiny organizations they could never make it to court. But in the event that you got to court, there's nothing like a legal agreement to help you out. It can help you. It can help keep you from getting to court in the first place. However, if you get all the way to court and there's no legal agreement, but there is a verbal consent like, yes, I understand you're going to put that online, that's great, then it can be debated, did they mean to give you copyright or did they not? It helps. So that's why I say it's always better to get it in writing, but it depends. It really depends on what you're trying to do. If this is just for personal use, it's a one-time thing, that's fine. If it's something that you want to give to an archive later on down the road, it may end up being the archive's problem, but they would really appreciate if you had a legal release, that sort of thing.
Right, I'm sorry, so that follows another question. You've got all this verbal stuff. What do you do with the paperwork?
Hold on to it. Make backups. Keep it with the original recording.
You got a shoebox full if you're doing a lot of these things.
You got a shoebox full, yeah. Or you have a hard drive.
Do people accept that kind of stuff?
Me people?
Well, I mean,
it really depends on the archive. You have to find something that's a good fit. And when you donate, bear in mind that there's going to be some processing costs involved. But yeah, for the most part, call up the archive that you want to donate it to and say, this is what I have, and see if they're interested. A lot of them will have collections committees and they'll work with you as like, is it a shoebox full of tapes and some loose papers with legal release forms? Fine. Is it a hard drive? Did you label the files in this particular way? Fine. In this book, we go over like how to organize your files, how to come up with standard naming conventions if they're digital, things like that. There's also public libraries or historical societies will sometimes do workshops on archiving your papers or doing digital preservation, that kind of thing that could be helpful to you. I'm just going to blow through some more of the basics.
Very quick. Scans of PDFs, PDF scans of your written are acceptable as records?
It depends on the archive. It really does.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's talk afterwards. Okay, so collecting your oral histories. We finally got to the interview itself, and I have 5 minutes to go. So I'm just going to go through these things really, really quickly. Let me see where I am. So how you collect the oral history depends on your project goals and the audiences you would like to reach. An archive with full recordings and transcripts, excerpted and curated pieces of text, audio, and video, may be good for engaging a broad public, public events, exhibits, things like that. When you get into the interview itself, explain the process. We just kind of went over that with the legal release. Sign the legal release, record the interview. With technology, things often go wrong, so make sure you bring a backup. If you've got, an iPhone, that's a bare minimum, really good, but have something else as well. You can get, sort of cheap MP3 recorders online or at a Best Buy. Bring both, have them both running. Listen to one of them with headphones so that you know the audio is working, so that at the end of the day, you know for sure you actually have it. Then save that digital recording in like 2 or 3 different places, on a laptop, on an external hard drive, in the cloud. Just make sure you actually have it. So many times people go out to record an interview and it gets lost. Have a plan and adapt, get the biographical context, and ask a follow-up question. I'm not going to be able to play those examples, but again, if you scroll through our website, you'll be able to see a lot of oral histories that are available. Listen for the quality of the audio recording. It's going to vary. Sometimes we hire a professional oral historian like myself to do the interview. They do a great job with getting really nice, clean tape. They don't say things like, oh yes. They don't cut the person off. They, they make sure that you can always clearly hear what the narrator is saying. However, a volunteer interviewer, when properly trained, will have relevant expertise and may be a really good bridge between understanding what the narrator is talking about and being able to ask specific follow-up questions, and also understanding that future audience, what they're going to need to know, and they can ask some really insightful things. So there's drawbacks to having volunteers. There's also benefits. I wouldn't say there's ever really drawbacks to hiring a professional, except that they're expensive. And I didn't really emphasize this enough, but have that audience in mind. Who are you speaking to? What don't they know? Where do they gather? How do they access information? In the case of the Preservation Archive Project, we're trying to get the stories of preservationists for other preservationists. So we think about, where do preservationists gather? We'll try to disseminate stuff in contexts like this. How do they find information? Well, like most of us, they Google it. So we need to have a really robust website. So we did our website, our online oral history collection, in this way. Everything that we put online we make available in Creative Commons, which means that as long as it's for non-commercial use, all of you can access and use those transcripts for your own work as well. Because again, we want these to be tools that are used by you guys. That is the goal. So we have it organized by project, by person. We make it as easy to figure out what this is as possible. We have their name, we have a short summary of who they are, but then we also have, up here you can see keywords of places, organizations, people that they talk about, and those will link out to other good information. Then we have the full transcript, and we have the full video if we have it, or the full audio if we have it. So we used to just put them online, because they're online. That makes them findable, right? Not necessarily. If you don't know who Lori Beckelman is, you won't necessarily click on her thing. If you open the PDF, it's not necessarily word searchable, and it's certainly not interlinked to other resources. So this layout, having this metadata, this information about the oral history, helps people to figure out who she is and why you want to listen to her very, very quickly. It helps them figure out, is she going to talk about any topics relevant to my interests? And if I don't know, I can click on them and figure out what those topics are, and then you can really get into the weeds. And in addition to having the PDF, which you can download for free, we also have it in the HTML code of the website so that you can word search to quickly find what you need. So because our goal is to make these usable, we thought about the permissions, Creative Commons, so that anybody can use them. We thought about the venue, online, easily searchable. And we thought about the content, and that informed how the interviews were even conducted to begin with. The release, the interview questions, the type of the recording, so that as the resources we have to conduct oral histories expand and then contract and sometimes disappear completely, we can sort of adapt to what those goals are and understand what our bare minimum is and what our ideal is. These are some useful resources. The manual which I've already given out. You can also go to Columbia Center of Oral History Research, Baylor Institute of Oral History, the Oral History Association. They all make great interview guides and things like that. There's a couple of books, Oral History and the Law, I've already recommended, and then these are sort of introductions to oral history project planning and things like that. We also have all of these listed in the back of the manual and on our website. So as long as you take this with you, you should have all of these as well. Yeah. So I hope I've shown you today that it is very complicated, but not so complicated that you can't get started. We really, really encourage you to do so, and feel free to come talk to me afterwards, for I am now out of time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. Hi, so
Our final session will be in W301.